Hello everyone, I'm Carolyn Cumsty Fowler and thank you for joining me today for this module in our Leadership Development series. We're going to be talking about listening, both to ourselves and to others. Let me start by sharing with you one of my favorite quotes from the Dalai Lama. When you talk, you are only repeating what you already know, but if you listen, you may learn something new. Listening is a transformational leadership skill. And when we talk about active listening, it's sometimes confusing because I'm not really talking about active listening. I'm talking about fully engaged, curious, and humble listening. And that needs to be something that we do to others, but especially to ourselves. You know, that voice in your head, that gut instinct that we tend to sort of push to one side because we're busy with our work. Transformational leaders understand the importance of paying attention to what they're hearing. I also love this quote from Ralph Nichols. The most basic of all human needs is the need to understand and be understood. And the best way to understand people is to listen to them. Now, I'm going to let that settle with you for a second while I'm going to ask you to reflect on this. If the need to be understood is a basic human need, then when we get any sense that we are not understood or we are not being heard, that upregulates us. So if I'm trying to explain something to you and I think you're either not listening, you don't care, or you just don't choose to understand, I'm going to upregulate. So whether that's in a phone conversation or a one-to-one conversation, because this is such a primitive need to be heard, if I do not listen, I can guarantee that the other person will react. That's something I'd like you to just think about and maybe observe in your practice and say, is that true? That if I'm kind of really not listening, people get irritated or they just walk away or they disconnect? Give it a try. We're going to do this in 2 steps. So in step 1, we are going to practice listening to other people. And then when we've wrapped up that and we've taken away our learning from that, we'll get back to ourselves. And we're going to do this in 2 parts and then 2 rounds within each part. So let me set this up for you. In part 1, we're going to have 2 rounds of 1 minute each. You're going to be working in pairs. And in the pairs, there will be 1 speaker and 1 listener. And just to help you decide, the person who has the longer hair will be the speaker in round 1. So what are you going to do? Speaker, you're going to think of something you've done that you're so proud of. And it's your responsibility to share the story of this something that you are proud of with the listener. Now, listener, your job is to not listen well. You have to listen as if you don't care. You can be distracted, you can be judgmental, but whatever it is that you do, you are not to listen kindly or attentively to the speaker. Speaker and listener, you have to notice how you feel. Does this feel natural to you? Does this feel comfortable? If you're the speaker, how are you feeling about speaking? If you're the listener, how are you feeling about not listening? I want you to pay attention. Your facilitator is going to give you 1 minute to do this. And then we're going to stop and you're going to switch roles. So the speaker will become the listener. You're not going to discuss it between the 2 rounds. Just 1 minute, a switch, and a 1 minute. And when you're finished, you'll have an opportunity to discuss what it is you noticed. And once you've done that, I'll come back and make a few comments. So I'm going to give you a moment now so that the facilitator can pause the video and you can have this listening experience. So now that you've finished and had this experience, I'm going to ask you, what did you notice? What did you notice during specifically the distracted listening piece of this? Did some of you find maybe that you had a harder time telling your story? And what's really important here is that I also want the listeners to think about if this was not easy for you, because many of us in this profession, this world, we're in a giving profession, a caretaking profession, a service profession. And so not listening is something that is often quite uncomfortable for us. So distracted listeners, what did you have to do to not listen? Let's get back to the speaker and just check a couple of things here. When you weren't being heard, speaker, were you able to communicate? Did you feel that you were heard? Did you want to keep sharing? How did you feel about not being heard? And very importantly, where did you feel that in your body? Was it here that you felt it? Or was it here in your chest or your belly that you felt the fact that you weren't being heard? And how did you know? What were you looking for that told you, this person is just not listening to me? Now, listener, how did you feel? And if this was not comfortable, what did you do to look distracted? Now, if you're like any of the other people that have done this exercise with me, there are several things that we do. We break eye contact. We roll our eyes, or we physically break contact. Many of us get back on our cell phones or look at our email or our texts. Sometimes people are writing things. And this is where the problem comes in. Because many of us think that we can say, well, I'm listening to you, but I'm checking my computer screen, or I'm checking my email, or I'm looking at the agenda. But the take-home message here is that even if we do not intend to appear distracted, our actions may be interpreted as not listening. And so when we are in the act of listening, it is essential that anything that can be perceived as a distraction, the cell phone, the computer screen, is removed from this interaction, because without that one-to-one physical presence, people will know that they're not heard. This may be harder if you're on the phone, but the real thing on a phone is you can have people know that they're being heard either with small comments like, yes, that's right, and I understand, or potentially asking a question to clarify. So, for example, you might say, well, could you just give me a little bit more insight into this? Or could you help me be sure that I'm hearing you correctly? Because then you're giving a direct message back to the person that you truly have heard them. Now, are you ready for part 2? So in part 2, we're going to do the same thing. 2 rounds, 1 minute per round. You're going to switch speaker and listener roles one more time. So this time, the person with the shorter hair is speaking first for this round. The same instruction for the speaker. Think of something you've done that you're proud of, you're really proud of. Now I want you to share it with the listener. But this time, listener, you actually care. You want to learn what they have to say. You want to hear about it. You want to hear this story. You really are engaged and curious about what it is the speaker is telling you. And once again, you're going to notice how you feel. You're going to do it for a minute. You're going to switch out. You're going to have the other person do it. And when you're ready to get back to me, I'll be here. So how did that work? How did you feel? What happened when people were really, really listening? What did you learn either about the way that you listen or the way that you tell your story, and how important it is for you in telling your story to know that you're being heard? What are you going to do with this? What insights can you take back to you? And I'm also going to ask you to start noticing now. Do you notice something about yourself when you realize that people are not listening to you? Do you stop talking, or do you posture? I mean, I know that personally when I realize that someone is not listening to me, I have learned just to stop talking. Because when I stop talking, people will realize, what happened here? And I will resume once I know people are listening to me. But I've also tried, and I have to admit I'm not good at this. I do interrupt people occasionally. I have to catch myself, but this is a practice, and it's okay, we practice. But I have learned to notice when my attention is wandering, or when I am starting to be tempted to look at my email or look at the message on my watch. And so we have to notice, because in noticing that my attention is slipping, or that I'm jumping very quickly to judgment about what the person is trying to tell me, then I have the ability to stop and pause and re-engage. Another quote that I just offer you, and I actually have given you a resource here, which is of 10 principles of listening that may be helpful to you. So when you are listening to somebody completely, attentively, then you are listening not only to the words, but also to the feeling of what is being conveyed, to the whole of it, and not part of it. And if you look on the left-hand side of the screen on that blue bar, you're going to see the word integrity. And integrity is a value that was selected by the cohort as one of their values. And integrity is not about being good, it's about being whole. The discussion of the strength, the discussion of the weakness, the discussion of the risk, the discussion of the protective factors, the discussion of what we don't have, the discussion of what we do have. And so when I quickly leap to judgment, when somebody tells me something like, oh, I understand the rest of this, that's not true. We don't. And so this action of listening is also to get at the whole of what they're saying. And if we think about it honestly, there are some times when we just don't have the words to say what it is we're trying to say. I mean, how many of you have had that experience where you're like, I just can't quite put it into words. Like I feel it, but it's just not there yet. And we need to have the time to sort of get it into words, to express it in a way that we feel comfortable with. Well, if the listener has just jumped in and gone on and answered and offered the next suggestion, we've lost that opportunity to convey what it is that we're trying to convey. But more importantly, listener, you've lost the opportunity to truly learn something valuable. So now I'm going to invite you to have a 2-minute round robin. I don't want it to be a long discussion, but I want everybody to participate in this. And I want you to think about what are important signs in one-to-one conversations or in meetings that active, engaged listening to understand is present. What would you see if that were true? And I want you to think about this because this is something that the coordinators practiced so diligently, and I was so thrilled to work in meetings 2 hours a month where active, engaged listening was present. It's so rare that once you see it in action, it is absolutely transformational. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to work with the facilitator to say, what does that look like when it's there? There are lots of things we see when listening is present. I'm sure you got a lot of them. Eye contact, people nonverbal, nodding or agreement, or questions, sometimes people leaning in, off their phones, not doodling, not distracted. But I love this quote, that the word listen contains the same letters as the word silent. And the presence of silence in conversations is the number one sign that listening is present. In fact, I went through a training with Dr. Monica Sharma that I'll talk to you about in another module. And she had a rule in our training, which was that when somebody spoke or asked a question, nobody could respond for several seconds. Now, initially it was hard, so I think it was 2 or 3 seconds. But when we were having conversations about things that were challenging or things that we really needed to bring ourselves to, she would sometimes impose sort of 10 seconds of silence before anybody could respond. The other unbreakable rule was one voice at a time. No sidebars, no muttering, no nothing. And so when you hear silence in conversation, that is your sign that people are listening. Now, Are you ready for step 2? Because now we get to listen to ourselves. And this is fun content, and I think we really enjoyed this as a cohort working on this. We have to learn to recognize our background conversations. These are the conversations that are going on in our heads and in our hearts, either when we're listening to other people, but actually they're very common when we're listening to ourselves. I don't know how many of you talk to yourselves, whether it's out loud or just silently, but I think as I show you this content, it will feel so familiar to you. And the term background conversation is a term that Dr. Sharma uses as well. And she says that as human beings, we constantly have background conversations, whether we're aware of them or not. But the trick here in leadership development is to be aware of them, because being aware of one's own conversations allows us more freedom of thought and action. Let's have a look at them. There are lots of them, but basically these are the 7 that Dr. Sharma describes, and they go like this. So some of the first ones tend to be more about when we're listening to others. The later ones often are very much the ones we have with ourselves. But imagine somebody's talking to you about a way of getting something done. And as you're listening to them, before you've even given them the opportunity to finish their argument or present the pros and cons, you're thinking, that's right, that's wrong. And the minute you think that it's wrong, you dismiss it. But the minute you think it's right, you may actually not be listening for, well, are there assumptions being made here, or could this go wrong? Very much the agree, disagree. And this is something we see all the time in political conversations and conversations about faith and beliefs. And, I have one belief, you may have another belief. And so the minute that I hear somebody talking about something that is not aligned with my choice, I say, well, I disagree with that. I mean, that's obviously. Or I may agree with it and agree with it without any curiosity or questioning. Another background conversation is finding the flaw or finding the problem. And the way that I think this shows up a lot is when people say, but, yes, but. And this is an interesting thing about listening. The word but, B-U-T, is an immediate sign that you have discounted everything that went before it. And I remember the coordinators presenting this content at the open house, because it was so dramatic to them that if I say, well, I think that this is a great idea, and I really appreciate the insight that you have in bringing it to me, but you need to recognize that X, or you need to consider X. The minute I say but, I have found the flaw in your conversation. And it's a signal to you that you have not been heard. And you know what? Finding the flaw shouldn't be a judgmental act. In fact, we want to say what could go wrong. We want to say, well, what could the opposite be? But we want to do that collectively. We don't want me to be the person who always finds the flaw with your opinion or statement or solution. Then there's the not responsible. And the not responsible often shows up as people zoning out. So we're having a conversation about how we improve a situation. And it could be you're listening to a colleague talking about maybe an accountability or discipline issue with one of their team. You don't work in that team. You've got enough people to worry about. And you're like, well, I'm really not responsible for managing that person. So I'm not really invested in listening. And so I don't take ownership. And this is the challenge here. I may not be responsible. It's got nothing to do with me. But my colleague is not asking me to fix my problem. My colleague is not asking me to be responsible for something I should be responsible for. Maybe all my colleague wants is my insight as a colleague about, well, if you were going to run this, how might you go at this? Have you got any suggestions? And so the minute that not responsible shows up in my brain, I can't be of service to them. I also, if that not responsible is, well, I'm not responsible, I can leave, it really gives me an excuse to disengage, and that's a challenge. Then, this is a huge one, the us versus them. And this is something that the coordinators shared with me can be a challenge when you are working as regulators and those in support of the regulators, and then you have your clients, the people that you are inspecting and regulating. And this was a breakthrough, I think, for the cohort, in that we realized that, yes, officially we're us and they're them, but ultimately we're all should be, or we all are, in service of patients. It can be challenging when we think they're not, but we really need to learn to think about, what does it feel like on the other side? Can we have insight and can we have curiosity about what it feels like on the other side? The either-or conversation, we all know this one. It can be that or it can be that, but what about that combination? Or it can be, this is either we're going to do what we've always done or we're going to do something brand new. Why does that have to be true? Why can't we keep what's the best of what we've done and improve the things that aren't working as well for us? It's not an either-or situation, it's a both-and situation. But usually the most dangerous and pervasive background conversation that we use on ourselves is the not enough. And what this means is, I am not smart enough, powerful enough, resourced enough, skilled enough, energetic enough. I'm not enough to do what it is I have to do. Or I don't have enough time. I don't have enough, maybe, influence. This is what we call the scarcity mindset. This is where I look at something and I say, I'm just not good enough. And there are some of us who've even said, sometimes I feel like I'm a fraud. I'm going to be found out that I've been given this responsibility, but I'm not really up to it. You know what? If somebody's entrusted you with it, it's because they believe you have the potential to do it. So maybe you're feeling that you aren't up to it, but you know what? It's a growth opportunity. It's something to grow into. And so instead of judging yourself for what you're not and being afraid of failing and so afraid of trying, recognize this conversation. So when this conversation says to me, Carolyn, you're just really not organized enough to make that happen in that time frame, I have to say to myself, well, what's this about? Background conversation. What are you trying to tell me? And I have a choice about whether I believe you or not. So we all have a favorite background conversation, and I'm going to invite you as you move through your work and your life to say, well, which are the ones that show up for me, and which are the ones that I notice showing up? Because this is the critical issue here. It's not say that we can make them not happen. They're always going to happen. Conversations like this are always going to happen. It's our brain trying to protect us. But the skill here is to realize that when we notice it, and name it without judgment, we can reduce the power of these conversations, these background conversations, over our listening, over our thinking, and over our responses. And so if I notice myself saying, yes, but, the act of noticing that I said but can say to me, you know what? You just discounted what this person was trying to say to you. Take a breath, take a pause, start again, because maybe you're about to learn something you need to learn. So now, in the final group discussion, I want you to think about what are the background conversations that you notice most, either within yourselves, and you can choose to do this in 2 rounds if you like, or whichever makes sense to you. I have no agenda, just discuss these questions. And then, which are the background conversations that you notice happening at the Office of Healthcare Quality? Now, I want to say one thing about this. It's very easy when someone asks you to notice what people are doing wrong, to go to a place of judgment and say, well, that person doesn't do this, and that person doesn't do that, and I do this, and I don't know. This is not what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you just to be curious. What do you notice? What does that mean? What are the conversations in which these things show up often? And really importantly, how do you think that you could help manage this once you notice them? Not by calling them out and judging them, but what could you as an individual do to enter this conversation in a way that is able to point out that the background conversations are there, but you want to have people notice their impact and step away from them? I'm going to give the facilitator time just to pause the tape. So thank you. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for listening to each other, and most of all, thank you for listening to yourselves. I'll talk to you soon.